So it's 12:30, so I think we'll make a start. Welcome to the seminar, and I'm chairing today because Phil can't chair and present at the same time. So it's my job to let you know that the seminar is being live streamed for postgraduate students, staff, and other interested people who can ask questions at the end of the presentation, or you can also do that in the chat box. The session is being recorded and the recording will be available on the department website afterwards. And can I ask everybody to switch off their camera and mute their microphone during the presentation, please. So I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is Phil Moffitt from the Department of Educational Research. And Phil specialises in interventionist research of technology enhanced learning practice. He's a chartered engineer, facilities manager, and a user experience ergonomist. I struggle to say that word, Phil, with interests in activity theoretical approaches, enabling people to collectively and expansively confront suboptimal work and learning for themselves. So a big welcome to Phil, and over to you. Looking forward to hearing what you've got to tell us.
Thanks very much, Kathy. What a generous introduction. As Kathy mentioned, I work and learn at the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University. I do indeed specialise in interventionist research of education where technology is embroiled. This is a second career for me. I'm a chartered engineer, facilities manager, and UX ergonomist, but in the past 12 years or so, I've gradually turned from practice, from being a practitioner, if you like, to the researcher practice. And for reasons that will come out in the next 45 minutes or so, I do mainly use cultural historiography because it enables, it enables us to help people to change their own suboptimal work and learning for themselves. I'm going to share today some examples of educational research using online change laboratories. The stuff it sometimes can be a little bit esoteric and theoretically dense. So I'm going to try to keep it relatively light and signpost resources if you wanted to read further. Please do ask anything you'd like, whether it's into the chat there or in 45 minutes or so. Before we start, I think we're all entitled to ask, as we're entitled to ask about any type of educational research, why would we bother doing it this way? Some frequent challenges directed at the Change Laboratory methodology is that it takes a long time, it's complex, it's theoretically dense, and it might not work anyway. Do you know what their fair charge is? They're actually raised by Change Laboratorians ourselves, probably most strongly. We can directly confront that if you want. We can counter that the easy things probably won't work, at least not in the long term. As an extreme example of a grand challenge, most projections suggest that by 2050 we'll have around 10 billion people sharing the planet. So that's 10 billion people to feed and to house and to educate and to keep safe and healthy and to allow to reach their full potential. So the idea that there's an easy solution to that seems ludicrous for Change Laboratorians. So, we believe we're not going to tackle those grand challenges through things like acquisitional models of education or by the pretense of top-down managerial or political consensus, or by our collective resignation to this Tina mentality where we roll our eyes and say, there is no alternative. We have to accept this. And all we can really do about it is go online and moan and call random strangers nasty names. That's not really the approach, because there are alternatives. We don't kind of know what they are yet, because the problems are entangled and they're ambiguous, and real social change, it involves collaborating with people we might not ordinarily work and learn with. It takes theoretically grounded long-term commitments, which not everybody's ready for, and that's fine. We need to understand each other's contrary perspectives of what's gone wrong and why. And again, not everybody's, up for that. We need to socially negotiate and enact material change ourselves, and we need to build on kind of what historically has worked well and what hasn't worked well. It's not true that everything now is rubbish and everything used to be perfect or vice versa. So all of that kind of needs to be examined. And it's not for everybody, but this is what I was hoping to cover. Maybe if you've got different expectations, or by the end, if you wanted to put, we can meet separately for a chat or something. I'll start with when it's worth considering an online change laboratory. I'll describe some sources of support quite early on for budding and established change laboratorians, not solely those who work online, but certainly if we're doing online configurations, those resources will help. It's actually a series of resources set up by Brett Bly, who's at the department here at Lancaster, and he's on the call now, which I'm pleased to see. And a global network of change laboratorians use this bank of resources and contribute to it, so it's as live as you can get. Then early on, I'll very briefly explain how we use something called activity systems as an enduring model of technology-mediated social practice to represent work and learning. I'll need to do that so that some of the other stuff makes sense, really. And then after that, I'll explain what we sometimes call the triumvirate of a change laboratory methodology, which is expansive learning, transformative agency, and double stimulation. I'll bring in a few recent examples there from research projects, just to make those bits of the triumvirate a bit easier to comprehend. Do you know, I went back and forth about whether to use one study for examples of all three or a different study for each one. And I think whichever decision I'd have made, we could safely bathe in retrospective regret and say that the other option would have been better. So in the end, I tossed a coin and I've picked a slightly different study for each one. So we've got, I suppose, variety at the expense of continuity. But you can always drop me a line if you want to talk about them further. As we go along, we can discuss examples of the material outcomes for participants themselves. I think from previous conversations with some colleagues, that's often the part that we can find elusive when we're trying to decide whether the investment of time and effort is worth it for an online change laboratory, whether the juice is worth the squeeze, that kind of thing. So hopefully that'll fall out. I'm just going to say now we're a couple of minutes in. I look at an oblique angle because I can't see out my left eye, and if I look directly at a camera, my left eye does something called pareidolia, which is it tries to identify patterns on the screen. It's really unpleasant for you to see, so that's why I stare off at an angle. Okay. So I should first point out a few fundamental things. One is that if we're doing a change laboratory, then we are irrefutably using activity theory. Hopefully that doesn't mean everybody's just left the call. The change laboratory is a set of methodological arrangements to design, conduct, analyze, and explain a specific type of formative intervention, one where we help participants themselves to expansively change their own work and learning for themselves. So you can see even in that short statement, it's quite laden with, sort of some heavy words, and I'll unpack them as we go through. So bear with it. There are many other types of formative intervention, but the change laboratory methodology, which we're talking about today, is specifically dependent on activity theoretical principles. That really means I can't just launch into recent outcomes because they won't make sense without us first kind of explaining some of those principles, theories, and methods. So I really promise, this is the only slide where I've just pasted in a load of text from a paper. I've embolded a few extracted words, and it's just for focus, really. The purpose of a change laboratory is to directly foster expansive learning. So I need to explain expansive learning, which I'll do in a bit. Expansive means we don't know at the outset which direction we're heading in, but we use a set of stable theoretical principles and methods to envision and enact change. So I'll describe some of those principles. It's collaborative, it's multi-voiced, it's motivated by some aspect of shared work and learning which is irrefutably failing. There might not be agreement on how it's failing or why it's failing, but it is failing, or it's at least suboptimal. If everything's fine, don't do one. But if there are material problems to solve, and those seem to be potentially historically and culturally embedded and ambiguous. And if there's disagreement about them, and if the people involved will find it safer, more affordable, or more convenient, and more collaborative to engage with each other online than do a change laboratory online. There are some change laboratorians who think the mode of intervention ought to reflect the problematic social circumstances. Okay, so um, some people do think online problems suit an online change laboratory, and physically co-present problems deserve a physically co-present change laboratory. I personally don't subscribe to that, but that's because I've had really positive results the wrong way around, as it were. So for me, the decision about mode and taking a change laboratory online, it's more about participant safety and privacy and affordability, and convenience, and the likelihood of them engaging. I run a lot of physically co-present. I don't run a lot. I've run an equal amount of physically co-present change laboratories as I do online change laboratories, I think. So before I show you some recent examples and look at the triumvirate, this collection of resources is where I'd start for methodological tools and tips and advice. And the examples that I'll run through in a while, they were certainly accelerated and qualitatively deepened by having access to these resources. The collection was initiated and maintained by Brett Bly, who, as I said, he's on the call now. I have to say that I'm not being sycophantic. He does an incredible amount beyond the Department of Educational Research in terms of capacity building for those of us who are less experienced change laboratorians. And if you feel you want something to do while you're pretending to listen to me for the rest of the call, I can wholeheartedly recommend just finding that site and bookmarking it, and just have a rummage around while I'm explaining examples. So what I'll do is I'll introduce examples, but if you wanted to look around, you'll see on the page there are editable activity systems. There's all sorts. These are just the recent releases. If you go up to the top and just click on maybe technical reports and then just scroll down a wee bit, you'll see the categorized. Okay. So I'd highly recommend that. And the reason it's probably worth doing as a side activity really is because it's watching me clicking around a web page isn't a great spectator sport, is it? So please do feel free to browse those resources either now during this or afterwards, and just compare them to the examples that I'll bring up. The resources are helpful because a change laboratory is a research intervention, or perhaps interventionist research, but the point is it's both of those things. So we confront urgent challenges. Um, Perhaps those problems are exhausting our current ways of understanding, so we need qualitatively deep and meaningful investigation, including human subjectivities, interactions with diverse others. Embroiled in that are technologies, and as we do that, we become increasingly future oriented and collaborative. So these interactions, they tend to be highly visual and material. So this isn't solely about the exchange of ideas. So to that end, we need to do a lot of planning. We need to do a lot of task preparation. And that can be done a little bit paradoxically, because we actually want to deliberately cede control of this whole series of workshops to participants themselves. And on that site, we can find templates of everything to kind of, domesticate to our own research intervention. So there's plenty of templates and instruments and advice and examples of everything that I'm going to show you are actually on there that you can embellish for yourself. Bureau de Change Lab, well worth a follow on X or on Twitter. So I'll just briefly explain this very persistent representation of social activity we use in work and learning. It's called an activity system, and I'll explain it because we do use it a lot, and it's got a relationship with the unit of analysis in an online change laboratory. This certainly isn't the only way of analysing collective human activity, which is technology mediated. Even for activity theorists, it's not the only way, but it is a prevalent model of collective activity, so it's worth us just talking about. So this is an activity system, sometimes called things like Engerstrom's famous triangles, and we use it to represent collective technology mediated activity in work and learning. But then what we do is we expose and aggravate contradictions in that activity. There's an editable version on the Bureau de Change Laboratory website that I encourage you, just play around with it. before you use this in anger, so to speak. I'll use this current seminar as a quick handrail, as an example of what we might represent and an example of what contradictions we might expose and aggravate. So over on the left there, we've got a subject. And the subject of the people directly involved in production for an activity. So what we're doing now, that's probably everyone on the call who's actively engaged. There will be people who aren't actively engaged but are on the call. People who are actively engaged and directly involved in attaining the object of activity through production. That's the subject. The object is over on the right. So we've got a social motive to what we're doing, the purpose, the driver, something with material implications. The object determines everything else about the activity, absolutely everything. So for us at this moment, the object of our activity, it probably isn't clearly agreed, but without getting too wordy, it's probably something related to sharing experiences of how online change laboratories enact material change. As the subject, we can't directly pursue that object. We're mediated by artifacts at the top. And those artifacts sit between the subject and object. Mediating artifacts can be tools which act on the world, and they can be signs which act on the mind. These things act in constellations as they mediate activity. So in our current activity, things like webcams, headset, Zoom, the right arrow on my keyboard, this notebook and pen that I'm using to keep track of things I want to cover, the chairs we're sitting on, the mugs we're drinking from, there's a constellation of artifacts there. If we move towards the base of this triangular representation, we've got, our activities, social and cultural mediators. The rules there are how we regulate what we do. Rules can be formal, so things like at present, things like laws about data protection, policies about accessible captioning, all of the things that Rebecca and Dee are probably going to help us to understand. Rules can also be informal, like social norms about, I don't know, on the call at the minute. Maybe we know without writing it down. But one of the things we do around here is we turn up for a seminar wearing clothes. And if we're presenting, we wait for the chair to invite us to speak and we don't overrun into the shared question and answer time, something like that. The community is anybody with interest and influence in the activity. So for us now, the community might include families and colleagues. They want access to limited bandwidth potentially. Or we've got workplace managers who want us off the call and back at our desks doing something that they've prioritized, for us to finish. The division of labour there, that's how we allocate tasks and reward. It could be very vertical and bureaucratic and hierarchical. Like some seminars you go on and you kind of don't have a chat function and your camera and microphone are isolated by the host. So the division of labour is that, you're a listener and there is a speaker. Whereas in our seminars, we try to imbue in the later time that ability to test and to challenge and critique, so that would be more horizontal. And lastly, we've got the outcome. And the outcome sometimes described as the object with value added or the object with intended and unintended consequences. So for us, that might be something like, we might have an outcome of feeling a bit more informed about options for undertaking educational research, or we might want to be we might want to undertake consideration of change laboratories in our own projects or dismiss them in our own projects. Or perhaps we just want an hour away from something else, or perhaps we want to show a friendly face and give some moral support to a presenter because he's not particularly popular and needs all the help he can get, something like that. Thanks if that's why you're here. So it's really important, probably the most important takeaway of this seminar, that the point isn't just to map that work and learning activity. The point is to use the activity system to then go on and identify, expose and aggravate contradictions within and between those elements. So an example on the webinar now, we might have the top-down imposition of some change in conferencing platform. So let's say at the top there, somebody at an institutional level said, you're going to have to use Teams. And that might be done with, I don't know, insufficient consideration of accessibility. Maybe there are people who use NVDA to be able to take part in the seminar, or software for hearing and visibility assistance, and Teams just doesn't have a good reputation with that. So, there might be a contradiction between the artifacts and the subject, or the artifacts and the norms of the seminar series, or other people who are involved, like people who have to turn that recording into something that can be hosted, all that kind of thing. The contradictions. So the bits in red are how we might start denoting contradictions between policy and practice. So if you look at the editable model there, you'll see some prompts to help us do that. There might be contradictions between policy and practice, between new technologies and established ways of working, between stakeholder expectations and the purpose of our activity. And that's really where the value is. So too many people kind of stop at mapping and think, "Hey, job done." It's not that at all. That's what you kind of use to then go on and expose and aggravate contradictions. There are different ways of analysing those contradictions. They're incredibly lucrative for change. I'll run down the clock if I explain them now, so I'll bring some out with concrete examples in a while. And then if you're interested in them further, you can drop me a line and we can talk about them. Let's just look at what happens between people who are involved in an online change laboratory. And I mean, one description is people in an online change laboratory do what people do in a change laboratory. They just happen to do it online. But in these online change laboratory workshops, we provide shared online spaces, probably using platforms like MS Whiteboard, Miro, Limno. There are plenty of others. And we make arrangements for people to collaboratively think and debate and work and learn. We do that at varying levels of abstraction. So they do model and expose and aggravate contradictions on an activity system, but they do other things as well. So this is a recent example of an online workshop. The screenshots taken, it's actually an ongoing online change laboratory, and it's to redesign visual media, which is used in sustainability education for the built environment. So that media largely excludes practice in the global south and largely benefits people who are involved in sustainability education in the global north. That's what the intervention is about. Okay. So over on the right, excuse me, you can see that we can see each other, we can speak to each other, we can interact through speech and non-verbal cues and different interactions. We can also examine ethnographic data. We call this mirror data. So preferably audiovisual, preferably irrefutable audiovisual evidence, which shows failure and our own role in that failure. And for this group, that's what these bits of mirror data do. They're actually videos just showing the role of these people in failing practice. We have an area probably around about the middle for what we call ideas and tools. And we bring in things like micro, meso, and macro, meso, and micro level policies and things like that to debate. And over on the left, you can see an activity system there. But over on the left, we have an area for models and visions. So our activities, our proposals for change and things like that. You might have noticed that the surfaces are in increasing levels of abstraction from right to left. So abstract models like the activity systems over on the left there, they can kind of free us from the constraints of daily reality, right? So we can get a bit of freedom of thought. Meanwhile, the ethnographic data over on the right, that's utterly concrete. That's reminding us of the need to do something concrete about a concrete problem. And so undeniably, it has got material consequences for real living, breathing people in work and learning. And we kind of oscillate between conceptual models and hard evidence of failure. And we do that while we're proposing and negotiating ideas in the middle there. So we don't just do it haphazardly or use, common sense or folk pedagogies. There are really important theoretical principles, which we call the triumvirate. Well, sometimes called the triumvirate, and I'll run through those. So as painlessly as I can, I'm going to run through examples of the triumvirate of expansive learning, transformative agency, and dual or double stimulation. And then what I'll do after each one is I'll show you a recent online change laboratory, which will make it a bit more material, I suppose. So for me, the first of the triumvirate is expansive learning. Expansive learning is how we engender a movement from the abstract to the concrete in a change laboratory. We tend to use these expansive acts to structure the workshops throughout a change laboratory, and the expansive acts are much more iterative than I'm about to imply. Just for expectation management, I think the fastest I've completed a series of workshops is 3 months. The longest I've heard of, which is it's a series of multiple cycles, is Annalisa Sonnino's research intervention of homelessness in Finland, which I think has been running for over a decade. Um, most of mine have been around 6 to 9 months, but it's disingenuous to say they're complete because they kind of keep running in one form or another. Well, we begin at kind of 12 o'clock there by questioning current activity and why it needs to change. We then move into analytical work. Um, it's kind of two different and related parts to that. The first type of analytical work is historical analysis. That's not to put on rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia. It's not to make judgments of past behavior based on our modern enlightened reference points or anything like that. It's really to understand how the activity that we currently have came to be the activity that we currently have, because that helps us to understand, well, which of our subsequent proposals are going to be capable of being sustained, which of these things are so historically and culturally embedded that we don't notice them anymore. And what we really need to do is bring them into the light and work on them, and um, incredibly deliberately, certainly more deliberately than we might have first thought. We then move into actual empirical analysis, which is analysing the current activity that we have in a bit more depth, and we can move then on to modelling proposals. So that can be quite a challenge because some people want to immediately start proposing solutions. We can't do that until we've gone through these. Then we can start examining the potential and limitation of the proposed change, and then we can test and implement, which is kind of increasingly concretizing, these changes through practical application with its enveloping practice, I suppose. And then we look to reflect and evaluate and then consolidate. Irio Engerstrom calls that consolidation bit establishing a stable form of practice. All the while, we're recognizing that this isn't ever complete. If you look back at the seventh act, for example, it doesn't return to the first. It kind of spirals into or out of the screen and in a dialectical way. So change moves with some evolution, a negation of the negation, if you like, that sort of stuff. Let's look at a recent example of a study. I can't run through every expansive act. I really don't think you'd want me to. So I'll focus on historical analysis and just show you something that we might do in that kind of maybe the third or fourth workshop. So as an example of expansive learning, this is an ongoing research intervention. We're currently about halfway through, but I'll talk about historical analysis, which I presented late last year at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. This is actually really sticky, so we are iterating around and we're probably going to have to start this again because of what we identified in historical analysis. But as a bit of background, there are 9 participants in this particular online change laboratory. It's based at a corporate training organisation in architecture, engineering and construction. That organisation is in turn a standalone subsidiary of a further education college in the UK. The standalone has a turnover of about 20 million a year and a gross profit of around 10 million a year. If you're not used to those, they're really healthy figures in terms of the ratio between the two. It employs about 160 people and it's established at the premier end of the architecture, engineering and construction market. The participants themselves work as media designers and corporate trainers. They're originally from Fiji, Nepal, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Ghana. The participants' original concern was that they recognised that English language media for sustainability education, it barely discusses vernacular practice. Vernacular means sensitive and functional for a given setting and culture and environment and people. They happen to use English as a second or third language. The initial feeling was that this might be some ESL related problem with media. Turns out it isn't. And this happens a lot in change laboratories where we find out that the real problem isn't the one that we originally thought it was. And in this instantiation, the real problem was exposed during historical analysis. So by using the structure of expansive learning, and by constructing and analysing and pulling apart these historically evolving activity systems together, what we discovered is that this organisation doesn't create media to promote learning for sustainability. It creates media to sell. It creates media to be monetized, and some of that media just happens to be in a deliverable work package which is labeled sustainability education, which is where these people work and learn. When we establish that as the object of activity, everything else about the historical evolution of that activity suddenly makes sense. The contradictions begin to make sense. The dilemmas in the daily reality of teaching make sense. Because imagery from the global south, which reflects sustainable practice in the built environment for the global majority, it doesn't generate as much profit as imagery about fuel cells and glass and steel and vanity structures and that imagery that will attract Western certification schemes for sustainable buildings, which simply isn't aligned with how the global majority live. So the person on the right there being interviewed, this person I'm just circling now, not pixelated. He's a strategist with the organization. He directs learning media design. Let's call him Mick. Mick's a perfectly decent person. He doesn't teach. He never has. He doesn't profess to know anything about teaching or sustainability or about built environments. He's great at selling things, including training media. He sells loads of visually impressive media, AR and VR, and digital everything. And he's really good at selling really flashy, ostentatious, high-end media about sustainability and built environments in Western Europe and North America and Australia and Japan. And he returns stacks of profit back to that FA institution. And to get to the organization to the point where it is, where it's returning so much profit, Mick's historical role has been in business development. He's ruthless and he's great at what he's paid to do. And he's got a lot of influence on our activity. And this is a really historically embedded problem for us to solve. I'm not claiming to solve it. The point is it's being done expansively. Mick pragmatically cares about sales and profit. And if we're going to succeed and concretize change, the change that the participants want, we have to address that historically embedded problem. We've got no chance of consolidating change with enveloping practice if we simply swap out the media and put in media that reflects more sustainable engineering for built environment. What we've got to do is address that culturally embedded and historically embedded stuff. So that's an example of expansive learning. The next method and principle we'll talk about, the second bit of the triumvirate, is transformative agency. And as a group of participants progresses through a change laboratory, they'll commonly show increasingly collaborative and future-oriented expressions. So initially the group will resist. They'll resist their own managers. They'll resist us as researcher interventionists. They'll resist each other, just generally resisting. And we actually encourage and legitimize and nurture and normalize resistance. It's a foundation for agency. If someone's resisting, they care, right? They care about something. They care enough to resist. So it's important. So that's great. It might sound a bit dilemmatic again, but if we're asking people to attribute blame and acknowledge their own role in failure, and we're asking them to expose and aggravate contradictions that are often uncomfortable and they're done in multi-voiced and socially antagonistic interactions that they might not be useful, they might not be used to, then we need to encourage resistance and criticism, including when it's directed at ourselves. And then after that, we turn towards something more substantive and explicit and material about what's going wrong. So then we come to explication, and then we can start to collaboratively understand each other better and the problematic social circumstances better. And then we can start to think about what to do. So we move from explication to envisioning, and then we start to make those self-commissive acts. I'll do this, and then we start to take action. So I'll show you an example of how those expressions might unfold across an intervention. It's a graph, basically showing you how they unfold. It was a relatively long intervention. I think there were 14 workshops, and it was conducted in higher education, this time with a group of engineers. They were learning about water and sanitation and medical gas supplies. These are the teams that are on rapid reaction, probably 12 hours notice to move or something like that. So they do things like build the Ebola treatment units that we saw in Sierra Leone a few years ago, and the temporary hospitals for the Caribbean hurricane relief, things like that, and the temporary COVID units that were built in the UK during COVID. This is about the relationships that they formed with video. Okay, so in this research intervention, the participants were getting, let's say, exacerbated with being provided stacks of visual media for their engineering HE, which they found to prioritize fidelity over contextual value. I'm not sure how to properly explain that, but I think you'll get the point. They were being directed towards incredibly complex and expensive and very flashy hardware and software, visually stunning technological things, but logistically unmanageable for spontaneous use and just the daily reality of teaching and learning. So essentially, when we started to model their activity and examine its contradictions, using all of those resources from the Bureau de Change Laboratory website, then we kind of start to find that mediating technologies, they are very flashy, they're very ostentatious, but they're epistemically hopeless. So we've got VR, AR, MR, XR, AI, iPads, drones, 360 cameras, digital everything, and servers running immersive experiences. And they might have suited other activity, but they weren't suited to this one. So there are expressions of transformative agency indicated concern at the start there in blue. This is criticism that the mediating technologies just didn't match the activity's object or its community or its division of labor. You can see in red that resistance is coupled to that criticism because they essentially become resigned to these conditions. They couldn't see how anything would ever be different. So, it's resisted because, what's the point kind of thing. As things progress a bit, we find that expansive tasks like the ones we were looking at earlier, they help them to explicate in that lime green color. So this starts off quite modestly and then kind of starts to lift a bit as we start to go through that expansive cycle. We start to realize what's materially wrong. And what's wrong is if they need to learn how to use a theodolite, like that middle image, if they need to learn how to use a theodolite to set out a camp or a road or something like that, well, the best way to do that is to get out a theodolite and spend time with someone who knows how to use it. It's not to go through a VR immersive simulator. But policy at the defence school means that students themselves have no ownership of media selection, in fact lecturers don't either, or of who they can contact in order to be able to learn how to use this stuff. It's very hierarchical, very bureaucratic. So towards the latter half of the research intervention in yellow there, you see this yellow stuff lifting up in the central core along with explication. We have the yellow, which is envisioning what might be. We start to think, well, what can we actually do about this? The mechanism for that's called double stimulation, which we'll cover next. Using activity theoretical analysis, which you can see on the right there from some interactive workbooks we were using, we expose a contradiction between the community and the rules. And as we do that, we're engendering those future-oriented and collaborative expressions of transformative agency. So we find this, there's a contradiction between community and rules, essentially. That precludes the use of personal phones and laptops under the pretext of defense security, but nobody can really say why phones are a problem for security. I can understand why they might be, but nobody can really explicate that. So, and nobody on the security side at this school could really understand the epistemic value of allowing people to use phones. So in a very agentic term, let's call him Paul there, who I'm circling. It's a very agentic turn. People come together, they aggravate that contradiction, and they eventually decide to take action to get a policy exemption, which is called a derogation. So you can see taking action there in the darker blue. I don't know, this might be something you'd expect, where committing to take action and then taking action seem to happen towards the end of this whole research intervention when we understand the preceding bits, I suppose, of that expansive cycle. So we get a policy exemption called a derogation. Prior to this point, there'd just been this kind of culturally embedded acceptance of a constraint based on the halo effect, I suppose, the assumption that people of a higher military rank must have good reasons for having this policy. And that was until the group kind of exhibited the collective and future-oriented transformative agency in asking why. That might seem trivial to a lot of people on the call, but it's not. It's very agentic for defence people, or at least military people, to ask why. And then to close off that workshop, we see the self-commissive acts in purple, where people are saying, well, do you know what, leave that with me, I'll do that, but if you can help by doing this bit. And then in the dark blue line, they actually do it. I remember a senior civil servant, he said to me, look, Moffitt, the last thing I want is a load of Marxist staff sergeants running around asking why every 5 minutes. And I thought, actually, that's really good. That's working a treat now. We're actually achieving something here. Um, let's have a look at this last bit of the triumvirate, which is double stimulation. I find this the most challenging to describe without getting us to actually do a task, but for reasons we might talk about later, getting a bunch of academics to actually do a task is nigh on impossible, frankly. So double stimulation provides a principle and method for our task design in these online change laboratories. It's kind of how we theorize the provocation and tracing of volitional acts. It might seem a little bit odd at first, but I think it'll make more sense when I've run through the phases and provided an example. So as I'm speaking, you might want to follow these phases through. That's if you're still with me. So I'm going to describe something called the original weighting experiment just to describe these phases. So in the original weighting experiment for double stimulation, start at the top left. A participant is placed in a waiting room and they're alone and there's nothing to do. There's some kind of vague explanation, like if you wait here. On the left in a sparse room, there's a clock on the wall and perhaps a seat, but there's not much else, and that's it. So the participant receives no further direction. And phase one is the conflict of stimuli between being asked to wait and having no purpose. That then arouses conflicting motives in phase two. So in phase two, we're kind of temporarily vacillating, I suppose, between leaving and waiting for the guide's return. And after some time, which varies for everyone, people do what we'd probably all do, which is to look at the clock and think, when am I going to leave this bizarre situation? In phase three, the significance of that is enhanced. And this is psychologists describe this as the most important part of the decision forming apparatus on the left. And what happens here is we give time agentic meaning, essentially. So it's promoted to auxiliary motive status. We decide that the clock will control our future behavior. Okay, so we create conditions when the hands of the clock reach a certain position, then I'm going to leave. And I probably look for patterns. I'd probably say when the fingers or the hands of the clock are at 90 degrees or when they're aligned, I'm getting out of here. This is ridiculous. In phase 4A, the hands of the clock then reach that predetermined position. So now I'm getting real conflicting stimuli, for that volitional action to leave. And then closing it is in phase 4B when I decide I am going to get going. And then I implement the decision, which is in the right-hand column there. Now, what was the purpose of all that? Because in these tasks for an online change laboratory, I clearly don't put people in a room with just a clock. But in online change laboratories, I might initiate phase one with a question or a problematic statement about some failing activity. That would be the first stimulus. Then I might give them something like a conceptual model to collectively adapt while they think about that first stimulus. That model might be the second stimulus. So, do you know what? I might use an incomplete activity system, or I might use something that's perhaps more familiar and, that has some kind of organizational significance to them. I don't know, maybe a Gantt chart, an organogram, or a history wall, or something like that. So I'll just run through an example. So for an example of double stimulation task design, I'm going to refer to this online change laboratory where Brett Bly and I facilitated a research intervention with 12 technical vocational education and training students. And they were studying part-time for a diploma in facilities management while they were working. The overarching problem they faced was that vocational training had little, if anything, in common with their subsequent work roles. They knew what those work roles were because they were working while studying. So they found that media was devoid of context. There was little in the way of work-related, social problems. Most of what they were doing, excuse me, most of what they were doing was based on memorization and recall as far as they were concerned, and it wasn't what their future roles would entail. So an example of a particular task is in this sixth workshop where these images are from. And the participants were really getting stuck into practice problems with learning media and platforms, which they knew just didn't reflect, social conditions in the profession, the problems that the diploma was supposed to prepare them for. So they decided they'd use video as evidence of this divergence, if you like, between vocational education and vocational practice. So in the first phase of this example of a double stimulation task to set up conflicting stimuli, they were asked to derive a new object of the learning activity. That seems quite advanced, I guess, but by this time we'd spent a lot of time together in online workshops. There was a lot of love flying around on Zoom for aggravating contradictions. So the first stimulus for this task was quite simply, well, if you want to change things and do things with video, what should the object of this new activity be? And the second stimulus was a partial activity system for that new activity, which they were completing together as they watched video diaries from predecessors and started to think about the object of activity. And they're kind of getting ideas for their own proposals for video, which you can see here. So this is what we're watching. And this is a reflective video, somebody else's reflective video of stakeholder engagement. It happens to be in maintaining industrial refrigeration systems for a cold store. That takes quite a bit of social negotiation if you're going to avoid destroying millions of pounds worth of food. This is us having a chat on Zoom, debating, challenging, and supporting each other about how the diploma needs to expose us to things rather than sterile procedures about maintaining bits and pieces in isolation from daily reality. And this is us scribbling and negotiating contradictions on an activity system on a shared whiteboard. So they're discussing whether these video diaries are a decent idea for mediating proposed activity, how the act of diarising would probably be misinterpreted. And you can kind of sense that, right? What would any of us think if someone just pulled out a phone at work and started recording things going wrong? So there's phase two, the conflict of stimuli. What I'm just going to do is swap out these images. I'm going to add this, which is a bit smaller, but I'm going to add some quotes. And I'm going to add that model of double stimulation. So it's a bit small, but at least you can follow the phases through while I'm just going through them. So just to recap, phase one, the conflict of stimuli, the first stimulus, we've been asked this bit, we've been asked to propose a new object. And the second stimulus, we got a partial model of activity, which shows us that, there's more to this than we first thought. As we're exposing and aggravating contradictions, we might have originally thought video diaries at work were a great idea, but when we start to consider the community in that activity, there's a contradiction because our bosses are probably going to say, what do you think you're doing? Video recording us failing at things. What are you playing at? So in phase two, we move from conflicting stimuli to conflicting motives, and the group negotiates using videos to evince problems at work to show the extant learning offers little value to them. So the conflicting motive originates in them jeopardizing their own reputations of trusted colleagues, potentially becoming known as someone who exposes failing practice. And one of the participants, let's call her Amy, she likes to remind us it's great to prove a point, but snitches get stitches, which is an idiom if you wanted to Google it. You might see where this is going next. In the third phase, in the attribution of auxiliary motive status, they negotiate drawing on overt social support from each other. So in the waiting experiment, the hands of the clock temporarily control me leaving. In this task, the group's mutual assurance bonds them, that material record of a social pledge, if you like. So in phase 4A, the real conflicting stimuli kick in because now they're back at work. They're away from the course mates who they meet online once a week for a Change Lab workshop. Now they're alone and they're relying on that psychological contract, trusting that they'd keep their social pledge. And closing the connections in phase 4B, it was described in the workshops as the point of no return. So that's the triumvirate of expansive learning, transformative agency, and double stimulation. I think I'm running down to a few minutes left and then I'll need to pack it in. So These tools and techniques are all available on this site. If you're conducting a change laboratory online or physically co-present or supervising someone who is, I'd recommend that. I'd recommend it anyway, but I would say that. While you think of any comments and questions, on a related note, some people were asking me about dialectics in an online change laboratory, or dialectics in a change laboratory. I think you and I were chatting about dialectics, Kathy, at one point, and a few others were asking. So there are, Ario Engstrom says there are three dialectical moments of a change laboratory research intervention, actually a fair few, I think. And they build on a fundamental dialectic of activity theory, which is a dialectical relationship between what people do and the socio-material context of what they do. So if I just take a few minutes just to describe these three dialectical moments while you think of any comments and questions. The first is a dialectical moment between the abstract and the concrete. So I guess an example of that is something like a bunch of facilities managers use the frustrations of daily reality in facilities management to share very abstract theoretical conceptual models, and then by aggravating contradictions, they change their material daily reality. So I guess that's an example of abstract and concrete. The second is the dialectical moment of the interplay of voices, and I guess an example of that is this top-down and bottom-up oscillation of sustainability education, where a load of operational staff get together in a bottom-up way to challenge a strategist and say, we need to include more vernacular media. We need to represent the lives of the global majority and the sustainability challenges for them. In a top-down way, that strategist very pragmatically explains that the media needs to be sold and this organization isn't a social enterprise. And then we get that countered by a more muscular form of collaborative resistance and calls for change, So that maybe that's a good example of the interplay of voices. And the third is a dialectical moment through time, so kind of past, present, future. An example of that might be the military engineers that we discussed. They expose culturally and historically embedded contradictions which preclude the use of phones under the pretext of security. And there are really important, historically embedded implications for that, not just about phones, but about their ability to ask why. So, that past, present, and future thing, they're asking why all the time now, I think. So that's about all I'd hoped to cover. I would say maybe if you're thinking about getting into it, have a think about whether, the material implications, if you're wondering whether the juice is worth the squeeze kind of thing. It's a process, not a product. It's a journey, not a destination. Is that all right, Kathy?
Many thanks, Phil. That was a great presentation, and I really liked all the examples that you've shared with us. So thank you very much for that. And I'd like
Oh,
to
there's still a few
invite
people left then.
all our participants in the room. You've just had a round of applause from many of them. I'd like to invite you, if you've got any questions for Phil, either to raise your hand, or if it's easier for you to type them into the chat and we can read them out. And perhaps while people are just thinking about what questions they'd like to ask, I'll start with one question. And my question, Phil, is about contexts where you can use Change Laboratories, because your examples that you've given us today are from FE and HE and technical vocational education as well.
Mm.
So what other contexts could you imagine using Change Laboratories in, and would they be suited for using with maybe children or young people or adults with learning disabilities? Are there any restrictions on the contexts, do you think?
For me, I haven't found any. The pedagogical approach is expansive, so I think as long as you're ready for an expansive approach, then you'd be fine. I'd say any setting, and I'd actually say I have no agenda for saying this. I promise you, this is a genuine and sincere observation. My own, and I've heard a few activity theorists say it as well. The most problematic people are academics in social science. Because you just can't, they just want to examine this model of activity in an expansive cycle, and they want to discuss it. And whereas if you look at TVET and practitioners in critical national infrastructure, people who kind of work and do a bit of work-related learning, they'll find it relatively easy, I think, to kind of get stuck into the point of it and to get going. Children, I've certainly done it at STEM clubs and coding clubs and things like that, and they've almost begun using the activity systems bits before you've finished explaining them, including identifying contradictions. So I'd say I haven't found any. I suppose there are some. I mean, I think there are a couple of seasoned Change Laboratorians on the call, so maybe they can add a comment if they found any limitations. But for me, I've found um, children to be probably the most straightforward and immediately engaging, um, followed by the FE and TVET sector. I feel awful because we're putting people in boxes and everyone's different, but broadly that would be my observations with vocationally related HE. Again, relatively straightforward once you explain that this is expansive, and it gets a bit meta with them. But yeah, academics and social science, it can be a train wreck, to be frank.
So
Is
how
that
do you go
okay?
about explaining the idea of a change laboratory when you're working with children or young people?
I think you start by setting out the part of the expansive cycle, but not using kind of Vygotskian terminology, by using terminology that they'll understand. They're quite often welcome. For example, if you're going to say, we're going to start off by questioning what you do and why you do it, and they can be quite enthused by that. I probably wouldn't use terms like historical analysis and actual empirical analysis, but I'd probably say I've certainly said with the STEM club, why do you think we do things the way that we do? Is it because of things that have happened in the past and we just kind of do them as normal? And they'll import, examples from home life or other people around them and say, well, yeah, I learned to tie my laces by doing this, so I kind of think that they're a safe bet to teach me other things. And they kind of bring in their own examples of that. Actual empirical analysis seems relatively straightforward to me with younger people because you're describing the here and now. And they say, I don't know if you've had similar experiences, but younger people just seem to have this more acute connectedness with the here and now than the rest of us. So they kind of expose things that you never dreamed of when you're doing um, actual empirical analysis. Modeling proposals for change, I suppose, can be a bit more tricky, but you have to recognise that ground. I think, I don't know if Vygotsky or Uriel Engerstrom or maybe Brett called it the germ cell, that kind of bit that you need to just quickly nurture in order to get it to grow into something more qualitatively meaningful. I suppose the more you do, the easier it is to recognise when a young person is saying something that has got potential, and then um, kind of encourage them to have a voice that they might not normally be expected to have in an educational setting. So you say, no, no, it's fine. Just tell us what you mean. Tell us what you mean. And then, once the stabilizers are off, you're away.
Thank you. So is there any other questions for Phil? Or any comments that anybody would like to make? Phil's recognised that we've got a few experts in the room. So is there anything that you'd like to add to what Phil has given us? Please do raise your hand if you'd like to do that. Or write something in the chat box. Brett, over to you.
Well, just a couple of comments, really. I mean, just in response to the question, the question about the setting, it's worth saying that, Phil works in the area of FEHE, vocational educational training with technology, as an interest. It's not that the Change Laboratory is only relevant to issues like that. I would say, in terms of Change Laboratories being used for such issues, Lancaster is known to do that. But if you go to the kind of conferences where people are using Change Laboratories, of which there are many, what's the most immediate thing you find is how varied are the various issues that people are using this approach to address. Everything from the decolonizing of land distribution in South Africa to the addressing of homelessness issues in Finland to all sorts of things. One of our colleagues who's at Wisconsin Madison is using it with in schools who are struggling to integrate Indigenous children with Indigenous communities. It's kind of a partnership between the Indigenous communities and the local area schools. So it's almost difficult to think of an issue that you couldn't apply this to if there are genuine contradictions and some stakeholders who have an interest in addressing those contradictions. So it's not all about technology. But obviously, there are many activity systems which are increasingly online, which is the background to this is about online change labs. And I think it's probably an issue worth emphasizing when it comes to technology enhanced learning, which is part of the context here. On the one hand, it's difficult to imagine any activity system that isn't technology mediated. But on the other hand, the kind of solutions and problems that we're discussing are not purely technology ones, they're practice ones. And what we're trying to often design is solutions which are new practices, which involve technology sometimes to a greater or lesser degree. So these aren't technology focused projects. They are focused on genuine problems in the world to which technology has more or less relevance, and it's worth thinking of it that way round, I would say. So, and it's also worth saying that we had a visitor to the department last year called Paulina Rantavuori, who was using this approach with young children to imagine their own futures. And there were all sorts of imagined things, people were dreaming of being K-pop stars and all sorts of things in that kind of project. It was a very different kind of situation than the kind of thing that Phil or indeed I tend to research, but it was very refreshing for all of that. So just in case that helps, Kathy, with a bit more context to your question.
Thank you.
While Brett was talking there, Kathy, I just had a look on very quickly on Google Scholar. So Change Laboratory and Further Education yielded 159. Change Laboratory in Primary Education 144. And Change Laboratory in Secondary Education 322. I know that's not it doesn't necessarily reflect accurately the returns, but just as an indicator. So it looks like FE and primary about equal and secondary about double.
Mm.
You thinking of it?
Personally, no. But yeah, it's interesting that people are using it in those different contexts. Really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, that point Brett makes about technology as well, that's quite interesting. And I would have loved to have gone into more detail about it, but time was a factor. That mediating artifacts can be tools and so that I struggle with the assumption that all technology is digital. So there are, some incredibly impactful technologies in education which are analog, aren't there? Like, a great big board at the front that we emulate digitally, but there are other types of surfaces and chairs and all that kind of stuff and pens. But some people say it's a bit futile to try and analyze the role of tools and signs separately as well. So I think one of Brett's great examples is a hammer. A hammer can be a tool which acts on the world, but a hammer can be a sign which acts on the mind, either in terms of its potential to shape timber, but also as a symbol for something like worker solidarity or something like that. So I think Irio Engerstrom says it. Sometimes it's not worth trying to separate them apart because we're not really sure what's kind of going on in here. I think his example was if I use a hammer to shape timber, it's acting as a tool because I'm shaping the timber by going like this. Or it's also acting on the mind because it's changing my understanding of timber's propensity to split. And that they're not easy things to detangle, are they? Did you see what I mean? So
and presumably they're acting on different minds in different ways as well. And people might have different uses for the same object.
yeah, so that's a kind of good working definition of the difference between artifacts and instruments. So you sometimes see at the top of the triangle of an activity system, it'll say instruments, and artifacts become instruments in use. So a hammer is an artifact. If it's then used for hammering a nail, it's an instrument for hammering a nail. But until that point, it could also be the same artifact could have been used as an instrument for, I don't know, a weapon, could have been used as an instrument for opening a bottle, or an instrument for holding a door open or something like that. Does that make sense?
It does.
So yeah,
It
it's
does.
fascinating. A lot of Vygotsky stuff going on there, isn't there? Which you'll like. I do feel for you here, Kathy, because there's, you know, when you're sort of sharing things, there's quite often just a bit of silence and nobody's typing and nobody's
Oh,
asking.
Brett's got another question or a comment.
I've probably said something incorrect.
No, you haven't. So it's about the kind of flexibility of the problem. So the thing to understand is, I mean, as Phil does know, I know, but I've got a book chapter in press which looks at this in the tell sphere. And one of the things you'll notice is that the solutions that people describe at the end of a change lab, sometimes they're impressive, sometimes not. But what they are is fitted to a problem that they decided partway through the project. If you compare the eventual solution that people came up with against the very starting point for the project, they often make no sense. So the issue is that the actual problem was reframed iteratively during the project. So how do you start, I suppose as a question, how do you start to think in your projects about what the problem is and what the kind of scope of the project's going to be and what will count as kind of acceptable deviation and what counts as something that I should just maybe tamp down because it's going off the track that I wanted to go on? What's your approach to that?
To get them to do it sounds incredibly indolent, but it's to get them to do it expansively. And I think, as you well know, I really struggle with the difference between doing a change or any research intervention, doing a research intervention for the people who are involved in it to achieve something, and the kind of research and scholarship side of it. I really struggle to tease those two things apart. So I think for me, kind of what I can say is the original problem has almost never been the eventual problem that we've solved. And it's usually been during historical or actual empirical analysis where we've then had to iterate all the way back and say, this isn't what we thought it was, because we've exposed and aggravated contradictions between the things at the bottom of an activity system, usually rules, but that again, that's probably because of the setting I've been in. If I look at a secondary contradiction between, say, rules and artifacts, between some new technology that was supposed to solve everything and policies that are just old and won't allow people to do that, then that will usually allow us to revisit the problem that we're setting out to solve. Is that what you meant, Brett? Have I understood your question properly?
It is what I meant, although you've kind of now brought in another issue, which I think is quite interesting. You know, this relationship to research and scholarship. I mean, often what we're trying to produce is not the solution. The solution is not what we think is most valuable. It's the knowledge of the nature of the issues and the possibility of moving forward is actually the valuable knowledge, right? It's not like I don't know, there's often this debate between people who do this kind of work and like design-based research where the solution is the thing that we want to get stable and refine and kind of change so that we can use it elsewhere. And the change laboratory approach doesn't really work like that. The solution is inevitably tentative and, you know, something that's of interest because of what it tells us conceptually more than anything.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brett. I can see Jan's got a hand up. Do you want to come in, Jan, and switch your mic and camera on?
Yeah, I have to remember my question though now. As I was listening to that. I think it was about obviously I've been around you and Brett enough that we can be talking about different things and you'll say, oh, that could be a change lab. And I just always get this sense that it's a huge commitment of time to do it properly. And I just wonder whether that is ever an issue. Is that true? And is that an issue? That sometimes in the context we work in, we need quick and dirty solutions? Or is it just actually we should just be pushing back against that and saying, no, let's try and go back to the idea of thoughtful, considered, taking a good bit of time. So it's the sort of timeliness of the change that I'm interested in.
I think it's the minimum viable time that you'd need, Jan, is the time to go through that expansive cycle. Bearing in mind, you do need an air gap really between each of those expansive changes. So if you're looking at questioning, analysis, which is to historical analysis, actual empirical analysis, model, examine, test and implement, reflect, consolidate, you're probably going to want at least a week between each of those, if that makes sense. So and you might also find if there's a particularly problematic group, and I mean problematic in a good way, a qualitatively meaningful way, you might want to split the first session into three. So to say there are three groups, you might want to do a separate workshop with each and then bring them into a plenary when you've told them all what's about to happen, because the interactions will be different than they used to. I would also generally have a session zero where you set out, the space and the arrangements, and you talk about socially antagonistic interactions, which are different than most people are used to. So you're probably looking at least 11 weeks, I would have thought. But there are other types of, activity theoretical stuff you can do, because I know you really want to get into that, don't you, John? You want to get stuck into activity theoretical research yourself. So there are other types of research interventions. They're just not change labs,
Yeah, of course, as we discussed earlier, I'm going to create a centre for activity theory and be the lead. That is a joke, Brett. That's a joke.
So I was wondering, Phil, if you could tell us a little bit about how you got into Change Laboratories, and I was wondering if maybe you had an opportunity to participate in one before you started using them within your own research, and whether there was a moment when you thought, yeah, this is what I really want to do. What's the story behind how you got into them in the first place?
It was a bit of both, actually. It was on the TEL program at Lancaster, and I think you probably already know. I really did suffer from it. I know people say imposter syndrome a lot, but I really, really struggled with it. I didn't understand what epistemology meant, ontology, all of this kind of stuff. And at some point, Brett, I think on one of the residentials, told us about this thing called the Change Laboratory. And I remember thinking, I have now arrived. This is something I can kind of start to understand. I can read a lot, in detail, and I can be perhaps because it's kind of processual. There's a lot of process, and it's that there's kind of a lot of structure to it. I could kind of cling to that and learn a bit more about it. I suppose prior to that was being exposed to activity theory. And when I kind of got exposed to activity theory, I thought, this is actually what I thought all educational research would be about. No disrespect to people who don't do that. If people want to sit and read Horkheimer all day, then that's grand. It wasn't really for me. Sorry, that sounded really passive aggressive, and I never meant it at all. And I honestly didn't mean it like that. I'm really sorry, but it just wasn't for me. I suppose, enact change, material change in some way. So it was that, I suppose. I have been involved in one. I've been involved in one by somebody who I originally took through a place called the Royal School of Military Engineering, has recently ran a change lab and invited me to be a participant in it. And we're about 3 workshops in to that. And that's quite fascinating.
So what's that like, being a participant?
It's weird. It's really weird. I'd have to really try and be almost Janusian. So any thoughts I have about scholarship and how I might do it, I just keep a little diary and keep it to myself, because it's not going to help. I have to remember the point of me being there is as a participant to be assisted in enacting expansive change. It's not to help, it's not to overtake.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great question, that, though. Thanks.
Any other questions from anybody? Beth, over to you.
Hello. I think, okay. Hi, Phil. Thanks so much. That was great. I've really enjoyed it. And I feel like there was so many things that sort of resonated with some of the work that we've been doing, and particularly in terms of this idea of expansive learning and not necessarily knowing the outcomes at the end. So I guess my question follows on a little bit from Kathy's in terms of how do you feel sort of you've developed at being able to run them? Is it something that you get better at over time? And what do you feel that you've learned from sort of going through that process? So you mentioned, say, problematic or interesting groups that you've worked with. What have you sort of taken from that process?
I guess the most important thing to say, and I mean it as a sincere offer if you want to talk about them, is don't do one without talking to someone who's done them. I think would be the most important thing to do. In terms of structuring them, I'd say go on that Bureau de Change Laboratory website and look at the pre-structured plans for delivering them and all of the tools, because it just takes, I suppose it takes away your brain power during a research intervention so that you can see the qualitatively meaningful stuff that's going on, rather than concentrating all the time on, oh, I've got to represent this model now and I've got to get things ready for the next bit. You adopt all that structural stuff and you really hope that you're not going to need it, Beth, because you're hoping that maybe 2 or 3 workshops in that people will say, do you know what, we don't want to do that, we want to do it this way.
Mm-hmm.
And you think, well, I spent a lot of weeks putting that together for nothing then. But you've got to celebrate that, I suppose I was glad that I'd read an account of an entire Change Laboratory before I actually did one, because I kind of knew what might come next in terms of planning. And to be honest, I've got quite a lot of right. So the mirror data doesn't just include the ethnographic data that you present, it also includes the recordings of the workshops themselves, because participants might well say, are you sure you said that in the last workshop? That becomes mirror data that you bring back in. Does that make sense? So kind of having the technical wherewithal to have access to all of this stuff can be challenging. And I think Brett will back me up on this. I'm sure Irio Engerstrom, who's one of the big hitters in it, maybe the biggest hitter in it, he sees Change Laboratories as something that are collaborative efforts between a lot of different researchers with a lot of different skill sets. I think it's fair to say you'd kind of balk at the notion of doing one on your own. So do them with a few of you, I suppose, at least the first once or twice or thrice. And I'll certainly help you. I'm fairly sure Brett would as well if you want to do one.
Yeah, I
Oh,
do
I
think
think I
it's
just rambled around the bazaars then. Did I answer you at all?
yeah, you did. Yeah, no, thanks for that. I guess the only thing that I would add is how much it sounds like it would be quite easy to sort of get stuck in the contradictions bit and stuck in that point. So is it something that you've sort of learned over time, as knowing when to intervene and when to move people along, or allowing more space and time?
Yeah, I think it's only yeah, and also every group's different. So what would you sometimes say? Oh, I know exactly what'll work here, and they're just like, no, you're all right. We want to talk about this all day long, you know. So that can be a bit of a challenge, and if it's important to them. So you have all these sort of task stimuli to bring out, and I think it's probably fair to say for about the first third, it'll probably work roughly how you'd planned, with maybe the odd deviation. And then in the central third, you can kind of get probably more accompanied by explication and envisioning. Perhaps because it's becoming more and more future oriented, they might also say, do you know, we don't want to look at that video that you've shown us because he did something last week. We really want to see that because that was a train wreck and we want to see what went wrong. So even the mirror data might take a different turn, which then means the contradictions might take a different turn. So in the, I can probably show you some videos, Beth, if you want to drop by. I'll show you some of the videos of actual workshops, and you'll see that quite often I'll step in and I'll say, is there a contradiction there? But I'll immediately step back. Otherwise, you know, you're at risk of kind of starting to draw stuff yourself, and you know, we're supposed to facilitate that. Yeah, Brett's gonna have to get off, he said, so I can start making stuff up now.
Are there any other questions for Phil before we finish? I think you've done a great job of answering all our questions, Phil.
Can I ask a question? Do you mind?
You can, absolutely. It's your
Jan,
presentation.
can I ask you a sincere question, Jan? Is that all right? Well, I'll ask it and then decide whether you'd want to answer it or not. If we looked at some like the negative dialectic stuff from Adorno, would that kind of fit with something like this? Because I've always been wondering about. I mean, we have very prescriptive notions in activity theory about primary contradiction, secondary contradiction, tertiary contradiction, quaternary contradiction. Do you think
You're almost putting value in people who sit around reading Horkheimer all day. Didn't take that personally at all. Sorry. So do you mean like the idea of non-identity, the idea of not being able to precisely capture? And that in activity theory, what you do is you do try and quite precisely capture these notions of contradict. Yeah, see, I think that would very much precisely capturing any sort of meaning would very much go against Adorno's non-identity and negative dialectics. Because it's almost in that space where it's really important to say that Adorno and early critical theory is not relativist. So it's not that meaning is anything, but meaning is made in that constellation of different versions or different possibilities. And it is existing in that sort of space that is messy. So it is very against precision.
Yeah.
Does that help?
It does, yeah, it does help a great deal. Because in this, you are trying to kind of pursue some precision, aren't you? Because okay, that's great. Thanks.
But actually, can we keep this conversation going sometime? Because that would be really interesting to explore that. Because I mean, they're coming from the same critical Marxist roots, and it would be interesting to me to understand how and why activity theory gets to needing these points of precision.
Yeah.
If I've understood you correctly.
Yeah, I'd like that. That'd be great. Thanks.
There's another paper written. Got the idea. The rest is easy. But that would be really good, Phil. So thank you for putting me on the spot. It's always good to be challenged.
Sorry.
Oh, we've got a question in the chat, Phil.
Oh.
So Rohit says, I apologise for not showing my video. I want to express my genuine interest in the Change Labs concepts, especially after hearing Brett mention it in the online sessions. After conducting my own research, it seems akin to the root cause analysis method I've utilised in the past with various stakeholders, although I understand there are differences. My question pertains to maintaining engagement and motivation among online participants throughout the process. How can we ensure their active involvement and sustained enthusiasm?
Yeah, it'll sound like a lazy answer, Rohit, but we do it expansively. So the double stimulation tasks are a useful framework because there's a nice bit of variety, and there's task stimuli. We make sure that the task stimuli are, I suppose, the task stimuli that you saw over on the left of the surfaces. They're abstract enough to free us from daily reality and people constantly saying, oh, we can't do that because of this. So an activity system, for example, allows you to expose and aggravate contradictions free from the constraints of daily reality. Meanwhile, over on the right, we've got this mirror data, irrefutable audiovisual data of failure, and preferably our own role in that failure. You could argue what could be more motivating than that, that very concrete, very visceral evidence that what you are currently doing is simply failing. And then over on the left, you've got those more abstract versions that you can expose and aggregate. So you're kind of oscillating between the two. I suppose that's an answer, expansively. Does that help, Rohit? I don't know if you want to quickly type. I suspect you can't put you're at work and can't put your camera on where you work. Okay, if it doesn't adequately answer you, feel free to drop me a line or something.
Oh, thank you, Phil. Thank you for answering all our questions. And yeah, we're almost at 2 o'clock. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Phil for presenting to us today. And thank you to all of the audience in the room and those who will watch the recording later. I'm sure it's been really useful. So the next online seminar will be on Wednesday, the 20th of March, and will be presented by Rita Hodozi, Miriam Battle Yazdiman, and Asad Lashari from the University of Nottingham. And the title is What is Sociological Research? Exploring Norwegian, Hungarian, and English student and staff views and curriculum documents. So we hope to see you all for that one. But thank you, everybody, and especially thank you to Phil.